Hello and welcome to coverage of Axion Now's monthly legacy tournament, Duel for a Duel, with me, Cyrus Bales. Each month, Axion Now hosts this little tournament that's usually around 5 rounds with a cut to top 8, where the finalists play off for a dual land and there's prizes for other people too. It's a great way to play Magic's greatest format and has a cheap entry fee too, so why not come along? So we're straight into it now. We've got 2 rounds of coverage to show you today, which is the semi-final and the final, so you get to see who took down the tournament and won what I believe is a bad lands for this tournament. So the player on the left is playing Infect and the player on the right is playing Merfolk. So the Merfolk player has led off with an island, whereas the Infect player has led off with a Glistener Elf and a Tropical Island, which is a much better start because they're on the board straight away and they have the ability to actually kill people on turn 2. The Merfolk player has played a second land of a Cavern of Souls and passed, so they've got no action going on early on, which is really not what you want in a matchup, which comes down to a lot of speed, because the disruption the Merfolk deck has generally is Force of Will and Daze, so it doesn't have a lot of way to interact with what the Infect player is doing, things like removal or whatever. The Infect player has tried to deploy another Infect threat in the form of Blighted Agent, which has been dazed, hardcast dazed, which you don't see very often. So the Merfolk player is untapping. They play another land and they're playing an uncounterable True Name Nemesis. So this clock isn't very fast and isn't too much of a worry against the Infect player. The bigger issue is whether or not they'll be able to block the Infect threats. Infect player has got another Blighted Agent, which is seeing the exact sort of disruption I was talking about. Force of Will's coming out and it looks like it pitched another True Name Nemesis. This time the Infect player is forced back. So they've managed to stick their unblockable threat, which is really important against the True Name Nemesis, because obviously the True Name Nemesis can block the Glistener Elf as much as it wants. Okay, so the Merfolk player has got yet another True Name Nemesis. This is a case of, can the Infect player deal lethal damage? Okay, yep, they've got it. So what they've done here is they cast Invigorate, which gives their guy +4/+4, and then Berserk, which doubles it. So effectively, they've given their creature +9 in one turn, making it lethal. So yeah, that was game 1. Quite a quick one. A lot of people say that Legacy is a really quick format, but really it actually takes a lot longer to play games because there's so much interaction and little nuances, and turns can take a lot longer. So it's not just a quick, explosive format, but it obviously does have draws where that can happen, as you've just seen. But if we think about that game, there was also quite a bit of interaction. We had a Daze and 2 different Force of Wills going on, so there was a lot of back and forth and opportunities for things to change around. The Merfolk player definitely fell down on not having any early drops. If it could have made some early pressure, it might have made quite a big difference. But at the end of the day, the Infect player's strategy is very good against Merfolk because it doesn't have that removal spell or anything like I was talking about earlier. So now they're going into their sideboards. The Infect player is probably looking at a few more little protection spells to keep its guys alive, because Merfolk doesn't have a lot of removal, but out of the board it might be playing things like Dismember, or there's a Merfolk whose name I can't quite remember that can tap down green guys and leave them tapped down. So it basically has a little ways of interacting. So it's obviously going to have more post-board than it does pre-board. So the job of the Infect player is to navigate the hate. Generally, I would say this matchup is very favoured for Infect. They don't have to worry about a lot of threats from the Merfolk player because their clock is just quicker. The only issue is if they get gummed up. Like if they're relying on a Glistener Elf to do all the damage, that can be difficult because there's so many guys on the field for a Merfolk player. However, Blighted Agent and Inkmoth Nexus basically get a free run because the Merfolk deck doesn't really have much in the way of flying and obviously can't block an unblockable. So it just becomes a case of whether the Infect player can assemble the right amount of pump spells quick enough to get round the onslaught of Merfolk that are obviously going to be trying to be played. If a hand much like the one in game 1 is kept again from the Merfolk player, they're probably not going to be able to win. They did have 2 pieces of interaction. But Daze is obviously a lot easier to play around than Force of Will, and if they're not playing anything and trying to hard cast Dazes, then they're going to be slowing themselves down, so it plays into the Infect player's game. Excuse me. Okay, so they've shuffled up and they're taking their opening hands. Let's see if we have any mulligans or if they keep them. Okay, they're keeping them. Okay, this is a much better start. This is the ideal turn 1 play from the Merfolk player, Ether Vial. So you see it in Modern a lot as well. It just lets you cheat on mana and also play your creatures at instant speed and without being countered. The Infect player hasn't deployed anything to the board yet. It looks like a Misty Rainforest to me. It's back to the Merfolk player. A second island. And what are we going to see? One of the many 2-mana lords in Merfolk. A lot of the deck is 2-mana lords, which is why it goes wide and goes big quite quickly. So we're back over to the Infect player. He's deployed an Inkmoth Nexus, which gives him one of his elusive threats, which is what he wants. Obviously, the Ether Vial is something he has to keep in mind because it can be tapped and deploy a Curse Catcher. So he effectively has to play around a Force Spike effect. Obviously, Curse Catcher doesn't impact against a Blighted Agent, so the Infect player is just deploying his Blighted Agent. So he's effectively got 2 unblockable threats now against the Merfolk deck. There was no end of turn Curse Catcher, so the Vial was just ticked up to 2. What you sometimes want to do as well if you're playing Ether Vial is always tap it at end of turn, just to see if you can get things out of your opponent, even if you're not deploying something. Of course, an Infect player being tapped out isn't going to really be able to interact with whatever you're doing Ether Vial wise. But if they have mana, maybe they'll run a one-off Stifle or something, which is sometimes something you see in Infect. So you might be able to bait that out. So the Merfolk player has deployed a Curse Catcher from hand, which we can only assume they drew, otherwise they would have deployed it at the end of last turn. They also have a Mutavault, which handily is a Merfolk, so it gets quite big, and now they have a Jitte. Jitte is very useful in this matchup for the Merfolk player, because if they can get counters on it, it gives them a way of pinging a removal across that can't be interacted with counter spells. They have to pump through the removal. So what it generally does is it slows down the clock, because the Infect player has to just chip away, because they can't go all in and pump their guy, because it would just get killed in response. So what they do is they hold the removal spells as protection. The pump spells as protection, and sort of chip in a little bit until they have enough to outplay the amount of counters on the Jitte. So we're back across to the Infect player. They're starting to stare down a board that looks it looks a bit chunky. He's still got 17 life to work with, so he's probably got another couple of turns before he really has to go all in, if that's something that he needs to do. I imagine we'll see an attack from the Blighted Agent this turn, because we're certainly not blocking. And he's not going to win this game by managing the board. He has to race. So we see what looks like a Windswept Heath to me. So he's in the tank a bit. I think what he's considering here is how much of a threat the Jitte is, and where he needs to put all his tools into dealing damage. So, because there is an option now to pump the Blighted Agent so that there's not a lot of... Okay, so this looks like an Invigorate. You might want to be able to go not all in, but try and get as much damage as you can do before the Jitte becomes active. So that looks like 5 counters, which would make sense because of the Invigorate. So he's halfway to killing his opponent now. So the Merfolk player is playing another Lord at end of turn, sort of cheating the mana curve using the Ether Vial, so you get to deploy more threats quicker. Excuse me. So the Merfolk player has, 3, 6, 9 damage on board and a Jitte. Oh, this is a really cute play. Vines of Vastwood gives a creature the ability to not be targeted. So what he's done is he's made the guy that's being equipped the Jitte to untargetable, so that the Jitte can't be equipped. And because the Merfolk player doesn't have another land, he can't equip the Jitte and get it online this turn. It's a really excellent play that's going to probably win him the game, I would expect. So he's just going to take the 9 to the face. It's quite a lot of damage, but like I said, he's got another turn still, which is all the Infect player wants, and he doesn't have to worry about the Jitte being online. So he needs to be able to pump this Blighted Agent by 3 because he's also got the Inkmoth Nexus. Or he can pump it by 4 if he needs the mana from the Nexus and the land that would tap to activate the Nexus. So there's a lot of combinations that work here. Does he have enough mana for Become Immense? Yeah, if he cracks the fetch land, we're getting towards Become Immense territory. So let's have a look. So he's got another land. I can see a Spell Pierce in his hand, which obviously isn't going to be doing a lot of good here. But his life total doesn't matter this turn because he's definitely dead on the backswing. It's a case of can he win this turn. So he might have a Brainstorm or a Ponder type effect, so he can look for the right cards he needs to win. Okay, it looks like he probably has it in hand at this point. He's not digging for anything else. So what is he doing here? Yeah, so there's the Become Immense line that we spoke about. And then we've got a Dismember from the Merfolk player, but I mentioned that we saw the Spell Pierce in his hand, so he's got the protection. So the Merfolk player, unsurprisingly, looks pretty dejected, and there we go, there's the handshake. So the Infect player managed to win that one in 2 straight games, as expected really. The matchup is quite favoured for Infect in my opinion. The play around the Vines of Vastwood was excellent. A lot of lesser players would try and use that to get around the Jitte counters, but in this case, our Infect player has outplayed the Merfolk player. Obviously, it could have gone wrong if the Merfolk player had another land and could deploy it and activate, but most people tend to play their lands first, and obviously the Merfolk player didn't have a lot of cards in hand because they've been doubling down on Aethervial to put more threats into play. So that's the end of that round, and then we're going to go straight into the next one. Right, so this is the final for the Legacy Duel for a Duel at Axion now. Just in the background, you can see a Badlands in a little stand. That's what they're playing for. So 2 players are shuffling up. On our left is the Infect player from the previous round. And on the right, I believe we're looking at Dredge. So both of these decks are quite speedy. Obviously, the aim of the Dredge deck is to put as much of the library into the graveyard as possible, and then make a huge amount of zombies and things like Icarid and recurring threats and just beat down, which usually avoids counterspells. So it's obviously good against that plan of the Infect. But it doesn't have much interaction aside from a Cabal Therapy. So the Infect player's got a pretty free reign to do what they want. Obviously, the Glistener Elf can get blocked quite easily by the hordes of zombies and obviously soak up any trample damage that might be caused. However, excuse me. However, if the Dredge player gets a good start and peels a lot of their library into their graveyard, they can Cabal Therapy away the threats. It has the power to be very explosive on turn 1. Both players are going back for less cards. This actually favours the Dredge player because obviously the Infect player is running things like 2-for-1s like Force of Will in order to protect against the explosive turn 1s, so it takes more of its resources, and obviously it needs a critical mass of pump spells as well as a threat and allows to play them. Whereas the Dredge player just needs to get the ball rolling, so you can mulligan quite effectively to 2 even on Dredge with just like Lion's Eye Diamond and Dredger even. Like, it's not a great hand, but it will get your engine rolling on turn 2. But so the Dredge player is quite happily to go down to like 5-4 cards without thinking too much of it because it doesn't use the resources in its hand very well. It's more about putting things in the graveyard. Obviously, this is regular Dredge, so it has Lion's Eye Diamond and mana rather than manaless Dredge, which one's on a whole other thing where you discard at the end of your first turn so that you can start the chain on turn 2, usually discarding Phantasmagorium and pitching a load of stuff. But not that many people play manaless Dredge purely because its post-board games are a lot weaker. But they keep printing all these interesting graveyard effects, so things like Creeping Chill and Prized Amalgams and loads more stuff that the normal Dredge deck can't fit in. So, you know, there are pros and cons to manaless Dredge, but I think on the whole, regular Dredge, like we have on the player on the right here, is the superior deck. So they've gone to 5. They're keeping it and they're taking their Scry because we're still on the Vancouver Mulligan, I think it's called, before the London Mulligan rule kicks in very short time, actually. So the Dredge player is on the play, which is obviously great for them. So they're starting off with Cabal Therapy. So at this point, both players must know what each other's deck is. So we can see the Infect player has a Ponder, a Daze, a Wasteland, a Tropical Island. I can't quite make out the 2 cards in the middle, but I would have to assume that one of them is a threat, because you wouldn't keep a hand without a threat. So we have a Ponder. So I reckon it was a Blighted Agent was the threat, which means that the Infect player, if they can find the right tools, might be able to win on turn 3. Getting to turn 4 against a Dredge deck might be a bit tricky. So they've shuffled off the Ponder, which is obviously the worst case scenario. You'd rather just see the 3 cards you want and dig into them. So the Dredge player is back. They haven't obviously started off their engines. So they've bought an extra turn to let the Infect player start up. And they know there's a Daze there, so they can play around it. So I'm curious why they're tapping both their lands for this, if they know that there's a... Okay, this is a pretty unexpected play. They're hardcasting a Narcomoeba, so they don't seem to have anything to get their engine going. I'm not quite sure why this hand was kept in this case. So there's the Blighted Agent I thought was in the Infect player's hand. And they've also got the Inkmoth Nexus, so they've got 2 unblockable threats effectively. Obviously the Inkmoth Nexus isn't unblockable with a Narcomoeba on the field, so I guess that's probably why they've played the Narcomoeba. But so we've got Cabal Therapy here. I can only assume that the Infect player doesn't have any dredges, otherwise one of the Cabal Therapies would have hit themselves to put a dredger in the bin. But obviously because they know the cards in the Infect player's hand, they can get a Cabal Therapy off here. It looks like they've taken, I think that's a Brainstorm from the Spellbook series. This is a very weak hand from the Dredge player. I think they probably should have mulliganed to 4 just to find a Dredger. You have to have faith in the engine that you have in your deck to be able to win, rather than trying to play this. Like post board, you can actually play a little bit of a control game against. Okay, so there's a Glistening Elf has been put in the bin via a flashback Cabal Therapy. I don't really like that. I think it might be better just to have the ability to block the Inkmoth Nexus with your Narcomoeba. But like I was saying, the game 1, the Dredge player can't really play a control game. But post-board, you get additional tools. So you get some artifact destruction, because obviously a lot of hate cards against Dredge are artifacts, which can also target Inkmoth Nexus. But more importantly, you get Firestorm, which is a really useful tool for being able to sweep away like a couple of Infect creatures. Okay, so he did have a Dredger, or he's drawn a Dredger, but he's having to cast it. So all that's going to happen here is the Infect player is just going to keep nipping away with the Blighted Agent rather than attacking into the Stinkweed Imp. Okay, so now we have a Sylvan Library as well, and yeah, so the Dredge players just lost their land. So they have 2 lands that can only tap once, so he's basically got Lotus Petals instead of lands at this point. And the Infect player has got a threat that can't be blocked, no clock coming back the other way, and Sylvan Library to filter cards and draw more if need be. And they have a Daze in hand against a player whose lands are not long for this world. I would say the Infect player is probably about 90% sure to win this game at this point. Okay, so there we see they become immense. And that's the end of the game. I don't think that was a great showing from the Infect deck. I think it was actually a poor showing from the Dredge deck. I don't quite know why that hand was kept. Yeah, it was a pretty tricky to navigate. And a lot of people worry about going down to like less cards. Like some people think 4 cards is too little, but with Dredge you can really do it. My only thought is maybe they did have the Dredger, but they wanted to not Cabal Therapy themselves. That seems like a strange play, not to just use the first one on yourself, just to get the engine rolling, because you're going to find more Cabal Therapies once you start dredging. So either they kept a hand where they could have been their Dredger but didn't, or they didn't keep a hand with a Dredger, or any way of getting things into their graveyard. So not quite sure about that one, but we're on to the sideboard now. So the Infect player is going to have some amount of graveyard hate tools. quite often it's Grafdigger's Cage, which stops Icarids and Narcomoebas coming back, which is the glue that holds the engine together and starts giving you the zombies and the ability to cabal therapy. And then if they're running a Dread Return package in the Dredge deck, it stops that as well. And it stops the flashback cabal therapies if they do hardcast some threats. Sometimes you'll see Paducah Bog in the Infect deck because it quite often runs a crop rotation package for a Wasteland. Obviously, being able to find more Inkmoth Nexus is useful. Also, Caracas and Paducah Bog. So it has a few options of things it can find. I've even seen Sajiri step once or twice, but not 100% convinced with that in the Infect deck. Since if you have any come into play tap lands, it's pretty damning for a deck that wants to be trying to clock on turn 3 usually. So from the Dredge player, like I mentioned earlier, they're probably going to be bringing in Firestorm if they have it in their sideboard, which is a really good tool. It allows you to put cards in your graveyard because you have to discard as an additional cost, but also lets you remove multiple threats. So if the Infect player goes Glistener Elf into Blighted Agent to try and get the most amount of clock they can get, you can take them both out and enable your engine and start the ball rolling. It's a really useful tool. A few other options, they're going to have to bring in something to deal with artifact hate. So I would expect things like Ancient Grudge, Wear Tear, Shenanigans, which is a new one, which I think is really good because you can keep dredging and then dredge that and then use it. So it gets around Grafdigger's Cage really well. So the Dredge player is starting off Gemstone Mine into Faithless Looting. So this is a much better start because they've kept a fuller grip of cards, but so they've discarded a Golgari Gravestorm, which is the best dredger. I thought I saw a Lion's Eye Diamond in the Dredge player's hand. They're probably waiting so that they can. I'm not really sure what the purpose of holding it back there was, because they could have used it to flash back the Faithless Looting. Obviously, they've got another draw here, so they can dredge into this. So maybe they wanted to keep it back in case they didn't hit another dredger, which is a good play. Can get behind that. And maybe they have some other draw effects so they can go really crazy on turn 2. Let's have a look. So we're exiling a Street Wraith to bring back an Icarid. So Dredge player's in his second turn and he's got no dredge in the yard, but like I said, I think we saw a Lion's Eye Diamond. Yeah, there's the Lion's Eye Diamond in his hand, so he has ways of getting dredges into the bin this turn, provided the Lion's Eye Diamond resolves. If it doesn't resolve, well, we'll have to see what else they've got in their hand. They have a multitude of other spells, things like Careful Study and Breakthrough, and Putrid Imp, so they have different ways of putting the dredger in the bin, but we'll see what he goes for here. Looks like a Cephalid Colosseum, which is another reason you wouldn't want to bin your hand on turn 1, because that's effectively 3 dredges in one turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it looks like they've got 6 cards in their graveyard. So they don't have Threshold yet, but they can easily get it. So there's the Putrid Imp, which is one of the things I was talking about to enable the dredging. And then we have the Lion's Eye Diamond. If there's any counter spells for the Infect player, there is an option to potentially use them here on the Faithless Looting to stop the dredging. However, it might be at this stage where the Infect player doesn't want to bounce a land for the days and just wants to be able to try and put as much power into the Glistening Elf as possible. But this game is looking very much in control of the Dredge player. There was no Graveyard Disruption on turn 1, and there was no counter spells on turn 1 from the Infect player, so the Dredge player has basically been allowed to have 2 free turns with a much superior hand to we saw game 1. So what have we got on the board now? So we've got a Putrid Imp, we've got a couple of Narcomoebas, we've got this Icarid that's going to die at end of turn, and we've got the Cephalid Colosseum for next turn to get lots and lots of dredges out. We see 1 Bridge from Below, so that's 1 token. And then we're back across the Infect player, who has a 1/1 Infector facing down a much more impressive board. Let's have a look. So the Infect player probably has another turn after this next one. But the Dredge player has the ability to keep the Narcomoebas back on blocks, so the The Inkmoth Nexus isn't going to be able to get a lot of work done against 2 Narcomoebas, and the Glistener Elf, how is it going to be able to attack through zombies and Narcomoebas? I would say the Dredge player is highly favoured at this point, unless the Infect player can try to get a Blighted Agent on the field, I think is their best option here. Crop rotation. Okay, so I think we're going to see the... Okay, so this is a really good play. So they've so he's activated Inkmoth Nexus, so it's a creature, and then sacrificed it to crop rotation, so it removes the bridges from below. But then also he's gone to get a Bajuka Bog, like we talked about earlier with the crop rotation package, to exile the Dredge player's graveyard. However, the Dredge player does still have 6 power on board and 2 flyers to be able to block threats that maybe fly. Okay, the Glistener Elf is blocking here, which is really not what the Infect player wants to do. Makes me wonder what's in their hand, because you throwing away your only threat means you're at least 2 turns away from killing. But I guess the Glistener Elf probably wasn't going to be able to kill through guys, although the Dredge player did tap out. Tap all their guys down, so we'll see. Let's have a look. Blighted Agent would presumably be the play that would make the last... Yeah, okay, so that makes that play make a lot more sense. Still not sure why the Dredge player swung with everything, or even why the Glistener Elf blocked. But we'll... let's do the maths. 2, 4, 6, 7. So we've taken an additional 2, so would have been on 9. So no, I still had another turn of damage to take. I don't think the Glistener Elf block actually changes the clock. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it would have been 7 and 7 instead of 5 and 6. So okay, they might have got another turn out of it actually. So I can see why the block went down now. So now we have the Blighted Agent. So at any point the Infect player could go lethal. Invigorate Berserk is a 2 cards on a Blighted Agent that is always lethal basically. It looks like we've got Brainstorm, which means that they don't have it. They're trying to look for whatever they can do. At this point, the Dredge player is pretty much just on what's on the board. So they've done their work. They've made some guys early on and forced some action from the Infect player to Bajuka Bog. Let's see. At this point, the Infect player isn't looking for interaction, it's just looking purely for pump spells to try and get the damage done. The Infect player has to do the full 10 Infect damage, basically on this turn, which seems very unlikely. They can theoretically survive by blocking the 2/2 zombie and taking 1, 2, 3, 4 damage and going to 1. But that would leave them in trouble. Oh, okay. I think what they're doing here is they're leaving the Inkmoth Nexus back to make that block. Also looks like their Brainstorm locked because they didn't have a fetch land to filter away what they'd put back on top. So unless those cards, well, I would assume those cards aren't good enough to win unless they had enough to pump it to a 9. So they're getting the 1 in this turn, then next turn we'll get the Lethem. But obviously the Putrid Imp allows the Dredge player to put another Dredger in the bin and start the whole chain going again. We've got another Narcomoeba, so there's even more things to get in the way of an Inkmoth Nexus. Also, the advantage of putting all these cards in the graveyard is to pump the Stinkweed Imp as well. Sorry, the Putrid Imp, not Stinkweed Imp. So at this point, the Inkmoth Nexus is going to have to block. Should probably just block the Imp. And then we're going to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, it's lethal. I think the Infect player has lost this one and they're probably going to go to a game 3. So even though Dredge is a really fast and explosive deck that can do some crazy things, this game wasn't they didn't have an amazing draw of, LED, Faithless Looting, Street Wraith all in turn 1 and making like 20 zombies or something crazy. It was just a... Okay, no, they seem to have survived that. 1, 2, 3. Okay, maybe there isn't quite enough cards in the graveyard to turn on the Putrid Imps. Let's put them to 1. At this point, the Dredge player is counting the cards in the Infect player's graveyard for the purposes of become immense, I would assume. But also they're just putting the Bridge from Below into exile because the Inkmoth Nexus did indeed die. Because we don't have the entire graveyard of the Dredge player on camera, it's a bit hard to tell if Threshold's been achieved, but I would assume it hasn't, otherwise we'd have seen an activation of the Cephalid Colosseums, and also the Infect player would have died. I'm not sure what the Infect player's hope is, since he knows the top 2 cards of his library, and obviously they weren't good enough last turn, so it seems like they're unlikely to be good enough this turn. Let's have a look. So we've got a Brainstorm again, but he's already Brainstorm locked, so what is he going for? So he drew the second 2 cards slower because he already knew what the top one was. Is it any good? So he's probably going to want to have a fetch land here and then some action. Probably Become Immense and Invigorate would do it. But doesn't look like he's going to get there. He's seen all the cards and that he's going to see this turn. Because if he plays a... Okay, there we go, yeah. I was going to say, because if he plays another cantrip effect off a land, then he's not going to have another land drop or any mana, only green mana to pump his guy. He'd need double Invigorate at that point. So the Infect player, sort of got the Dredge treatment there. He managed to interact a little bit, but by that point, the Dredge player had already started the chain rolling and had the ability to restart the chain via a Putrid Imp. But, that's a much more sort of slower and measured hand from a Dredge player. It kind of got its engine going. If he'd have had that hand in game 1, he probably would have been fine as well, I think. Obviously, Blighted Agent is a hell of a threat because you can't really do anything about it as a Dredge player unless you have your Firestorms. We didn't see any Firestorms milled over in that, so we can't be 100% sure they have them, but I'd expect them to. It's pretty standard for Dredge. I always personally run 2 or 3 in my Dredge sideboard. It's just a useful tool. And it slots in quite easily to when you can board out other things that enable you. So yes, they're going to game 3 with the Infect player on the play, which is quite a big deal. It means that they can, deploy a Glistener Elf and maybe get to actually attack with a Glistener Elf on turn 2, rather than having it blocked, because the Dredge player is usually by turn 2 the Dredge player is going to have some amount of things on the board, but by the end of turn 1 quite often you don't, unless you have one of the really explosive hands. So they're drawing their opening 7s. Are they going to keep them or not? So if I were the Dredge player, I'd want a pretty explosive hand, or mulligan to find things like Firestorm as my discard outlet, because then at least you have some interaction as well as starting your engine rolling. Obviously, if you mulligan to a Firestorm and Dredge hand, it's still a fine hand, but if your opponent is on the Inkmoth Nexus plan, then it looks a bit awkward at times. Let's have a look. What we got here? So we have Fetch Land from the Infect player into Gemstone Mine and Cabal Therapy. Now, is this Cabal Therapy targeting the Infect player or the Dredge player? So I could see the Dredge player targeting the Infect player just to hit Blighted Agent. Okay, so we got a Force of Will out of it. So it sounds like the Infect player probably had one threat that was a Blighted Agent. Yeah, there we go. It's the premier threat in a matchup where blocking is the main way that they can interact. So we go back to the Dredge player. So he's facing down potentially lethal next turn from this Blighted Agent. So what he's going to want to do is fire off some amount of Cabal Therapies this turn. So what is the best way of him doing this is the question. So he's playing another land to play around potential days. And now he's going to careful study. So he's going to need some sort of draw to start dredging this turn and get something into play so that he can Cabal Therapy, unless he's got a Putrid Imp that he can play now and then Cabal Therapy. But he needs to do something, potentially. A flyer is also fine. Okay, so we've got a draw. So this is the Faithless Looting. So we're going to see at least 6 more cards in the graveyard. So ideally he's looking for Narcomoeba plus, well, he doesn't need the Cabal Therapy because it's already there, but 2 Narcomoebas would be the ideal to be able to... Okay, so you have the Cabal Therapy, he's got no threats coming back into play. So this is quite a problem for him at this point. So he's very much on the let's hope that the Infect player doesn't kill me this turn. Let's see. Okay, Invigorate Berserk combo. There we go. And that's the end of that one. So yeah, that was a game. As you can see, both of those decks are relatively linear, and their interaction is the Infect deck has a little bit more interaction because it has the crop rotation package and it has some counter spells going on, and it can refine its draws via brainstorms and ponders. Whereas the Dredge player is very much just all in on their strategy with the occasional Cabal Therapies to take things apart. There we can see the Badlands that the Infect player has won. So it's a £10 entry for, tournament, so it's pretty cheap and enjoyable. And one of our players walked away with a Badlands, and there was prizes for other people as well. So it's definitely worth checking out. Axion now runs 2 Legacy events every month. So the first Wednesday of every month is a Wednesday night Magic of 4 rounds of Legacy, and it's Swiss. And then they do a duel for duels like we've just watched here, and that happens once a month, usually on a Saturday. It's not a fixed Saturday in the month, but I believe the one for July is the 20th of July, and I don't know the date for the one in August. But they're a cheap tournament to enter. You get to play the best format, and someone gets to walk away with the dual lands. So you can't ask for more than that, or a better Saturday than playing a nice bit of Legacy. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching the coverage and it's made you a bit interested in Legacy, and maybe you'll pop down and join us. We always have spare decks as well, so why not come along and enjoy the greatest format of Magic the Gathering. Alright, thank you for watching the coverage, and keep slinging cardboard. Goodbye.